Rick did a fantastic job last week as he preached about the encounter with Jesus and Nathaniel. Helping us to see how we all come from somewhere and that we're conditioned and we're shaped by a lot of different things. He also helped us to see that when we have someone like a Philip who can bring us to Jesus, so that Jesus can walk with us and help us to see who he really is, and we can get a better understanding of what it means to really live for him. We're going to continue this morning the encounters with Jesus. So you can be turning your Bibles to John chapter 18. We're going to get there in just a little bit. A few weeks ago, I found myself feeling a lot of different things, to the point one night that I couldn't sleep. And just so you know, that's very rare for me that I can't sleep at night. I usually sleep pretty well. So that night was a rough night for me. Early the next morning, I texted one of our elders. And I asked him if he would give me a call because I needed to talk. So he called me quite early that morning because we're normally both up pretty early in the morning. And we talked and we prayed together. We cried together on the phone. And that started for me a journey that I really need to begin to think about and take a look at in my own life. I began to realize that I was creating a narrative in my own mind. And I was starting to become and starting to make decisions based on that narrative. I was on the verge of making that narrative a truth. And then I began to stop that narrative because I started looking more intently at Jesus. And that narrative came quickly to an end because of what Jesus said. Over the last several weeks, I've been in many, many different conversations with many of you. And I know that many of you are hurting. And you're hurting for different reasons. Some of you have been hurting for quite some time. And I understand and know that you're seeing things that are hurtful, you're hearing things that are hurtful, and you're even experiencing things that are hurtful. So what I want to do this morning is talk to all of us about what I've learned over the past couple of weeks that has helped me to deal with the feelings that I've had as I have looked very intently at Jesus. And I pray that these things that I've learned by looking intently at Jesus will also help you to be able to look intently at Jesus and to help you deal with, just as I have had to deal with, a lot of the challenges that we are facing right now in our world. So this morning, the title of the sermon is simply this: The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. Before we jump into John 18, I want to give you just a little bit of background of what's going on. The story that we're going to look at, it's part of the crucifixion story. And we're very familiar with that particular story. And one of the things that we know is that the chief priests and some of the Jews, they did not like Jesus. And they created a narrative in their own mind about who Jesus was and who he was not. And that narrative became their so-called truth. And that so-called truth led them to make some decisions and to do some things that wasn't good for Jesus. That so-called truth impacted many different lives. And we know that so-called truth ultimately led to Jesus' death on a cross. So I want us to pick up this story in John chapter 18, because one of the things that we can see with that so-called truth that they had and that they had created, it didn't matter what Jesus did or what Jesus said. They filtered those things, what he did and what he said, through their so-called truth. And what he said made no difference. And what he did made no difference. Because their so-called truth is what they began to live by. John chapter 18, starting in verse 28. It says, then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea? Jesus asked. Or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at a time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify! Crucify! But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jews insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid and went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, If you let this man go, you are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. As we look at this encounter between Jesus and Pilate, we see Pilate wanted to know from the chief priests, what is the charge that they were bringing against him? So the chief priests and some of the Jews, then they began to speak their narrative. Pilate said, "Well, you take him and you deal with him." But they knew that they could not execute Jesus in the way that they wanted him to be executed. That's why they're bringing him to Pilate. Since Pilate couldn't get really anything from them, he goes and he talks to Jesus. And there are 3 things in this encounter that Jesus said, and one question that Pilate asked that radically helped me to see some things in my own life that I needed to understand. The first thing that Jesus said, if we look in John 18, in verse 33, when Pilate went back to talk to him, the latter part of that verse, in verse 33, he asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And then Jesus gave him this response. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world." That statement right there made a significant difference for me. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world." See, Jesus wanted Pilate to know that, yeah, he is the king. And yes, he is the king of the Jews, but he's also the king of the Romans and he's the king of the entire world. But his kingship and his authority, it didn't come from here. Had nothing to do with this world. It didn't come from here. But then he says something else that I really had to take note of. He says, if his kingdom was from here, if his kingship was from here, if his authority was from here, he says, then my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. He says, but now my kingdom is not from this place. You see, we know that Peter, he tried to fight with that sword. And we know just a few verses earlier in chapter 18 that he cut off Malchus's ear, that soldier. But Jesus healed Malchus, put his ear back in place, but he rebuked Peter. Because he said, that's not the methodology that we work off of. See, I had to see that as a kingdom servant, as a disciple of Jesus, my methods have to be kingdom methods that I use to deal with worldly or earthly problems. Because the kingdom that I'm in and the kingdom that Jesus is the king of is not from this place. So the methodology that needs to be used has to be the methodology of the kingdom. This was a great reminder for me. A great reminder for me. Because it helped me to deal with some of the things that I was feeling. And I realized personally for myself that the kingdom methodology that I personally needed to use was love. But I will say this. It is hardest to love when you're hurt. We know what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but I want us to look at it again. Verse 4, it says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. It's hard to love when you're hurt. It's hard to be patient when you're hurt. It's hard to be kind when you're hurt. It's hard not to envy when you're hurt. It's hard not to boast when you're hurt. It's hard not to be proud when you're hurt. It's hard not to dishonor or be rude to others when you're hurt. It's hard not to be self-seeking when you're hurt. It's hard not to be easily angered when you're hurt. It is hard not to keep records of wrong when you're hurt. It's hard not to delight in evil when you're hurt. It's hard to rejoice with the truth when you're hurt. It's hard to feel protected. It's hard to trust. It's hard to have hope. And it's hard to persevere when you're hurt. But what Jesus tells me here is that love, it never fails. No matter how you're feeling, love never fails. No matter what your situation is, love never fails. That's what I had to remember. That's what Jesus, that's his kingdom method. Love. What I need to do right now is love. And I believe this is especially needed in our congregation right now. We need to love. You know, it's interesting that I believe the Holy Spirit wants us to hear 1 Corinthians chapter 12 because it was read earlier in our service and it's in my notes too. So maybe the Spirit really wants us to hear this passage, 1 Corinthians 12, verse 24. The latter part of that verse, in verse 24. It said, but God has combined the members of the body and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it. So that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Let's hear that again. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. We got to hear that loud and clear. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. See, it only takes one part to suffer, but God calls every part to suffer with it. It only takes one part to be honored, but God calls every part to rejoice with it. See, we don't get the option as the children and disciples of Jesus to pick when we're going to suffer with the part and when we're going to rejoice with the part. Each part, he tells us, needs to suffer with it when one part hurts. Each part needs to rejoice with it when one part when one part is honored. Each part needs to do what it needs to do. That's what God is calling us to. Right now, I appeal to you and help you understand there's a part that is suffering. each of the other parts need to suffer with it. That's what God calls us to. We need to have equal concern for each other. I need to have equal concern for you, and I need you to have equal concern for me. I need you to have equal concern for everybody in your house church, and they need you, and they will have equal concern for you. It's something that each of us has to make a decision to do, because that's what God calls us to do. That's his kingdom method. The kingdom method that we have to live by right now is love. And Jesus lets us know what that love will do. John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35, he says, "A new commandment I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." He says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Oh, how amazing it is when we are obedient to Jesus. See, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." You see, the truth will set you free. That conversation that Jesus had with Pilate didn't end there. It continued. And Jesus makes another statement that really helped me. In verse 37 of John 18, it says, "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying that I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." That's a statement that hit me. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. You see, Jesus was telling Pilate that if you want truth, if you care about the truth, then you will listen to me. You won't listen to that narrative that the chief priests are bringing you. You'll listen to me. And I had to ask myself, Clayton, what so-called truth are you listening to? See, the answer to that question was going to determine which side I was going to be on. And I decided I wanted to be on Jesus' side. Because I realized that the truth isn't found in my local government. The truth isn't found on social media or any news outlet. The truth isn't found in Washington, D.C. The truth is not my truth or your truth. You see, Jesus said in John 14, verse 6, he says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me." So I had to ask myself, how do I, as a black man, navigate my way through this messy world that has hate, that has hurt, that has racism, bias, prejudice, and so many other things? How do I, as a black man, navigate my way through this? I have to align myself every day with the way, the truth, and the life. Because that's the only way I'm going to get to where I ultimately want to be, and that's in heaven with God. And Jesus has the way, he has the truth, and he has the life to lead me there. And only he can lead me there. You see, I know that if I listen intently to Jesus and I act in accordance to what he says, then he'll lead me to be with God. You see, everybody on the side of truth listens to Jesus. And when we as the body of Christ, when we decide as a collective body to align ourselves every day with the way, the truth, and the life, oh, what an incredible beacon of light that we can be to everybody outside of God's kingdom, to help them to see the way that they need to go, to help them to see the only truth that there is, and to help them to see the life that they need to live so they will surrender to Jesus. And he can lead them to be with God in heaven. See, Jesus said, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. See, the truth will set you free. Their conversation continued. There was more that they had to say to one another, Jesus and Pilate. And there was a third thing. Because Pilate, after Jesus' response, he had a question. A question that many have asked and thought about. In John 18, verse 38, he says, what is truth? What a great question. Pilate didn't even realize that he had the truth sitting right in front of him. He was staring at it. He was talking at it. He was talking to the truth right there and didn't even realize it. He didn't understand it. He didn't get it. And sadly, that's the case for so many in our world today. They don't understand, or they reject the fact that there is absolute truth. And there is absolute truth. You see, for so many, truth is relative. You can have your truth, and I can have my truth to so many. But truth is the absolute standard in which reality is measured. It's the absolute standard in which reality is measured. And that standard, that absolute standard, is Jesus and his word. That's what we've got to measure things from, because that is the truth and the absolute truth. You see, the truth doesn't change based on a situation. It doesn't change based on my perspective. It doesn't change based on how I feel. So whatever situation I have, whatever perspective I have, whatever feelings I have to measure it by the absolute standard, which is Jesus and his word. Because that's going to direct me to what I need to do. You know, I've asked myself many questions over the last several weeks. And many of the questions that I was asking, they began to limit my focus, so I really couldn't see the big picture of what was going on. One of those questions that I asked myself, though it's a very valid question, and it's an important question to have an answer to. That question that I asked myself was this: is racism in God's church? And though a valid question, I realized there was a better question for me to think about and for me to answer. And that question is, are people hurting in God's church? And once I began to think about that question, it helped me to put things in the right perspective. And I thought about what Jesus chose to do. See, Jesus laid down his life for all of us. It didn't matter what the sin we were in. It didn't matter where the sin came from. Because Jesus realized they're hurting because of that sin. And I need to help them. So I realized that, when people are hurting, I need to help them. It doesn't matter where they're hurting from. I need to help them. If they're hurting in our congregation, I want to be able to help them. You see, the truth is what's going to set you free. Jesus is the truth. As this story continues, we see that Pilate, he ended up having Jesus flogged. And the soldiers, they slap him. They come to him again and again, and they thoroughly humiliate him and inflict great pain on him. And they were hoping that this would satisfy the chief priests and some of the Jews. But with the narrative that the chief priests and some of the Jews had in their minds, they were only going to be satisfied when Jesus was crucified. So we pick up the story in chapter 19 in verse 8. So when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Jesus is amazing to me. This statement that he made also really helped me. He says, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." See, this was significant for me because he lets Pilate know that you only have that power and authority because my Father gave it to you. And the power and authority that God gives to anyone, he gives it to be used for his kingdom purposes. And if anyone chooses to use that power or authority outside of his kingdom purposes, God is going to deal with them. And I don't have to worry about it. You see, Jesus had no concern for the power that Pilate had. He could care less because he knew where it came from. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't scared of what Pilate could do to him because he knew his God, his Father, was going to take care of that situation. He wasn't concerned about that. If you don't believe me, you think about the kings in the Old Testament that were in power and the things that happened to them because they rebelled against God. Remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4? See, God is big enough to take care of any authority that he institutes because he institutes the authorities. So he'll take care of them if they aren't doing what he wants them to do. Maybe not in this life, but if they don't repent and surrender to Jesus, the next life is not going to be pretty for them. See, God can take care of that. I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to fret about that. I don't need to let that be something that has me up at night, restless and worried, because God will deal with that. See, Jesus helped me to understand that. Then he says, "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." You see, Pilate didn't know God's word. He was clueless. But the high priest who handed Jesus over to Pilate, he knew it. He understood it. He knew what the text said, but yet he still rejected it because he had his own narrative in his mind. And that's what he was acting off of. You see, we as disciples of Jesus, we have the absolute standard. This is the power. This is the authority that Jesus has that we need to listen to and that we need to act upon. Sadly, we see the choice that Pilate made. He chose to listen to the narrative of the chief priest instead of listening to Jesus. And he handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. But what's most alarming is what the chief priest said when Pilate asked him, "Shall I crucify your king?" They said, "We have no king but Caesar." Their narrative had clouded their judgment in such a great way that God was no longer a part of it. I didn't want my narrative to lead me to that place. So as we think about these things, my kingdom is not of this world. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. As we think about what truth really is, and as we think about the fact that The authorities that are in place will have no power unless it's given to us from above. That power is given to them from above. We don't have to be worried about that. See, these are some of the things that I have learned by intently listening to Jesus. And it's helped me tremendously to deal with all that I've been feeling. I pray that we all will intently listen to Jesus and let him be the one who guides and directs the narrative that we need to listen to. Because that narrative that Jesus has is the truth. The truth will set you free. Amen.